am writing this account because the High Perch Archival Directorate requires one, and because I have been unable to stop thinking about it since the last human ship withdrew. Let me be precise. That is the thing I know how to be. I have been first counselor of the Vatheri High Perch for 11 cycles, and in that time, I have written 417 formal incident accounts, atmospheric cascade events, hull stress surveys, supply shortfalls, 2 quarantine declarations and 1 partial ring evacuation during the Devhari gas plume of Cycle 9. I'm not given to sentiment in official documents. I do not ordinarily find myself sitting at the account terminal for 3 days, writing a sentence, deleting it, and beginning again, but I owe this one an honest accounting, not only to the Directorate, to myself, and to whatever record outlasts us. The High Perch was, at its peak operational capacity, the foremost diplomatic and relief routing station in the Vathar Reach. 42 years of construction, completed in Cycle 3 of the current era. A full orbital ring above Vatharsal, our homeworld, with 17 habitat sections, a great chamber where the Diplomatic Council held formal session, an administrative wing housing the Sector Relief Allocation Bureau, 4 docking spires, and an observation gallery that looked down through the planet's upper cloud layer to the green and copper landmasses below. We governed relief routing across 9 systems from here. If a species in the Reach sent a distress ping, it came to us first. We decided who received aid, in what quantity, and in what order. I had always considered that a source of appropriate pride. The station had been designed with a theoretical operational lifespan of 80 cycles. The initial construction consortium had been thorough. The load-bearing frame junctions were engineered to a 300% stress tolerance, above any projected operational load, and the outer hull was layered with a composite plating that our materials engineers had certified as the most resilient available in the Reach at the time of construction. The annual structural surveys were routine formalities. I had signed 44 of them. None had flagged a primary concern. This is worth stating because it is true, and because I want to be clear that when I say the fracture event was unexpected, I am not making an excuse. I am establishing that the station's structural maintenance record was genuinely clean. If there had been prior warning signs, they were not surfaced in any survey that reached my desk. The fracture event began on the 44th day of the current relief routing season. I was in the administrative wing reviewing a routing docket, the Cathali Water Station resupply authorization, which had been sitting in queue for 3 days waiting for my signature, when the first resonance alarm sounded. Not unusual in itself, the ring's structural monitoring system generated perhaps a dozen resonance flags per standard cycle, most of them minor vibration events in the outer hull panels, resolved within hours by the engineering corps, without requiring my involvement. I noted the alarm, sent the standard acknowledgement to Coordinator Fesivar's team, and returned to the docket. The second alarm sounded 12 minutes later, the third 9 minutes after that. On the fourth alarm, Fesivar calmed me directly, which was not standard protocol. His voice carried a quality I had not heard from him before. Not panic, nothing so unprofessional as that. A controlled compression of tone, as if he were choosing each word with unusual care. He said, "First Counselor, you need to come to Section 12. Section 12 housed the ring's primary structural frame junctions, the load-bearing nodes where the ring's inner and outer hull layers were pinned to the central torsion spine. I had never had cause to visit Section 12 in 11 cycles. It was maintenance territory, narrow service corridors smelling of coolant and metal fatigue, the air always slightly cooler than the habitat sections, the overhead lighting functional rather than comfortable, junction housings the size of ground vehicles, their surfaces dense with sensor leads and monitoring conduits, the kind of space that exists to be inspected and not thought about. When I arrived, I understood immediately why Fesivar had calmed me directly. Frame junction 12 alpha had fractured. Not cracked, fractured. A full-width shear through the outer housing, running, approximately 40 degrees off the ring's circumferential axis, through the secondary breach in the hull skin adjacent to the junction I could see. Actually see, with my own eyes, unmediated by any display or sensor array, the upper atmosphere of Vatharsal, 600 kilometers below. Pale orange haze at the atmosphere's edge, the cloud layer bright in the orbital daylight. Tween me and it nothing but the cold of open space, through a gap in our hull that had not existed that morning. A thin but measurable atmosphere bleed was already occurring through the junction gap itself. Festivar's instruments showed it, slow, steady, not yet catastrophic, but entirely without a trajectory towards self-correction. Frame junctions did not seal on their own once fractured. They continued. The mathematics were not complicated. A fracture of this magnitude in 12 alpha did not occur in isolation. Torsion load that had sheared the junction had redistributed itself across the ring's adjacent nodes. Junction 11 beta, spinward. Junction 13 gamma, anti-spinward. Possibly farther, 10 delta, 14 epsilon, depending on how the load was carrying. Festivar had already begun the cascade model when I arrived. He walked me through it with the methodical clarity of a man who understands that bad news delivered precisely causes less damage than bad news delivered imprecisely. His projection, 40 to 70 hours, before adjacent junctions began showing secondary fracture signatures. Once secondary fractures initiated at 2 or more adjacent nodes, the cascade would become self-sustaining. Sections 4 through 7, and the Great Chamber itself, approximately 30% of the ring's occupied volume, would begin losing structural integrity. Pressure loss would follow, not instantaneous, but progressive and not reversible by anything in our equipment inventory. The high perch housed 11,400 Vathari. Permanent staff, their families, the full diplomatic corps, the administrative and logistics cadres, the engineering and maintenance teams, the station's school system, the medical facility, and the archival directorate itself, all of them here, in a structure that was now on a clock. I returned to my office. I want to be careful here about what I record next, because the sequence of contacts is a rare of documentary record that the directorate can verify independently, and I want my account to be precisely consistent with that record. I am not selecting which contacts I describe. I am describing them all. We submitted our Priority 1 distress ping to the Sector Relief Coordination Network at the 44th day, 8th hour of the current relief season. All required fields complete. Structural cascade event, atmospheric breach, 11,400 at risk, 40 to 70 hour response window. I signed the ping myself. I attached Festivar's cascade model in full, along with the structural monitoring data and the engineering corps' recommended response parameters, specified oxygen reserve support for the at-risk sections, and structural engineering consultation for the junction assessment. Expeditionary support fleet responded within the hour. Unavailable. They were already committed to the Palavar Bridge collapse response, 2 systems spinward, and had no vessels to divert. Their duty coordinator expressed formal regret in the standard language. I logged it. The Kelthori Mutual Aid Compact responded within 2 hours. Their nearest available vessel was a light cargo hauler with supplemental oxygen capacity, rated for approximately 250 people. In a short-duration atmospheric deficit situation. They were willing to send it. I told them we appreciated the offer and asked them to hold it pending further assessment, because a vessel rated for 250 was not adequate for 11,400, and I did not want to commit a docking spire to a vessel that would not materially alter our situation. The Sector Relief Allocation Bureau's own reserve fleet, my fleet, the fleet we administered from this station, was committed. 3 vessels at the Velhari relay station awaiting dispatch authorization that I had signed 3 days prior, now en route to standing obligations. The Devhari resupply, which we had scheduled 6 weeks in advance, and which could not be deferred without compounding an existing food security situation in those systems. The Kethali Water Station emergency, which was itself a Priority 2 event. I logged this without comment. The irony of administering a relief fleet that could not respond to our own crisis was self-evident, and did not require me to elaborate on it in the board. The Mehethal Compact sent formal regrets at the 4th hour. No vessels positioned within viable transit range for a 70-hour window. Accurate. I had already checked the routing matrix myself before sending the ping. The Gavorian Civic Alliance at the 6th hour, their medical frigate, which would have been exactly the right class of vessel, was in scheduled refit at the Gavorian Orbital Yard. Estimated completion 14 days. Formal regrets. Accurate. The Outer Reach Independent Relief Trust acknowledged the ping at the 7th hour, informed me their board would convene an emergency review session within 48 hours to assess their available response capacity and determine an appropriate allocation. I understood what this meant. A board convened in 48 hours would deliberate. A deliberation would produce a recommendation. A recommendation would require ratification, by which point our window would have closed in one direction or another. I logged it. By the 20th hour, we had received 12 responses. 11 were some form of unavailable or insufficient. 1. The Kelthori light hauler remained on standby offer, which I intended to take as a last resort if nothing else materialized. We had also begun the emergency protocols internally. Atmospheric rationing activated in the at-risk sections. Movement orders issued to begin consolidating the population toward the structurally stable sections of the ring, the docking spires designated as overflow capacity. Station staff had been on emergency rotation since hour 6. The school system had been suspended. The Great Chamber had been evacuated to precautionary status. The Diplomatic Council could meet in the administrative wing if a formal session became necessary, which I hoped it would not. The thing about our emergency atmospheric rationing is that it is precisely what it sounds like. Everyone in the affected sections receives a calculated allocation of processed air, distributed through the emergency mask network rather than the station's normal atmospheric circulation. It is adequate. People do not suffocate on ration masks. They breathe, they function, they are uncomfortable and frightened, and the air tastes of the processing. Chemistry, and there is no margin for anything other than existing. The children were calm because their parents were calm, and the parents were calm because the station staff were calm, and the station staff were calm because I had told them to be, and because Festivar's team kept publishing updated cascade model data every 2 hours. And the data was not good, but it was legible, and legible bad news is easier to live inside than silence. At the 36th hour, Festivar told me that Junction 11 Beta was showing the first preliminary stress signatures he had been monitoring for. Not fracture yet. Fracture stress indicators. He estimated 6 to 10 hours before the indicators progressed to the fracture threshold, updated the distress ping priority to critical, and expanded it to the secondary contact list. The secondary list had 14 entries. They were species-level contacts outside the primary compact network, organizations and cooperative bodies that had registered with the sector coordination network as relief-capable entities, but that, for various reasons, did not hold full certified status in the Vathar Reach's routing matrix. Some were too small, some were too new, some were in the process of certification review that had not yet concluded. They were the secondary list because they were secondary. Supplemental contacts for situations where the primary network had been exhausted was precisely what we were now in. I sent the expanded ping to all 14 at the 40th hour. I did not review the list before sending. I sent it as a procedural action required by the emergency protocol, the way one activates a fire suppression system, not because one believes it will, but because the protocol requires it, and the protocol exists for reasons one has previously accepted as sound. The 13th entry on the secondary list was the Terran Interstellar Relief Cooperative. I will now explain, as accurately as I can, what the Terran Interstellar Relief Cooperative was, and what my relationship to it had been prior to this event. Cooperative was a Terran relief organization, species-based rather than system-based, meaning its membership and funding came from a single species interstellar community, rather than from a consortium of systems or polities. In their own terminology, they described themselves as a non-governmental humanitarian organization operating across multiple sectors, with a focus on large-scale atmospheric and structural emergency response. They had been active in interstellar relief work for approximately 30 years. Their operational footprint, as documented in their applications, covered 7 sectors, including the adjacent sector to the Vathar Reach. In Cycle 7 of the current era, the cooperative had submitted a formal application to the Sector Relief Allocation Bureau, my bureau, requesting certified status as a recognized relief operator in the Vathar Reach. The application was extensive. 43 vessels documented, including a hospital ship division, an oxygen production fleet, structural engineering teams, medical and trauma capabilities, and a logistics core. They had provided operational records from 6 prior relief engagements in adjacent sectors. Their documentation was thorough. I had reviewed the application. I had assigned it to a junior coordinator for initial assessment, received the coordinator's report, reviewed the application myself, and consulted with 2 members of the Diplomatic Council on the policy implications. Then I had denied it. My stated grounds: the cooperative certification protocols, while documented, did not precisely align with the REACH's operational standards framework. Their medical personnel credentials required cross-validation against VAIATHARI certification frameworks before they could be recognized for operational deployment in the REACH. And there was a precedent concern, admitting a new class of operator to the routing matrix, particularly one operating under a species-specific governance model rather than a multi-system institutional model, required establishing standards that we had not yet codified for that category. I offered provisional observer status pending a 2-cycle review, which would have allowed them to participate in information sharing and coordination exercises without operational authorization. Cooperative had declined the observer status, understandably, in retrospect, since observer status carried no routing privileges and would have cost them the administrative overhead of participation without any operational benefit, and submitted a revised application the following cycle. The revised application addressed several of the procedural concerns I had raised. It included updated vessel certification documentation, a framework for cross-validating their medical credentials against VAIATHARI standards, and a proposed operational protocol adapted to the REACH's matrix requirements. I had reviewed it. I had found it substantially improved. I had denied it again. My stated grounds for the second denial: the vessel certification updates included in the revised submission were documented as self-reported recertification assessments rather than independent third-party verification. The REACH's certification standards required that vessel certifications be verified by an accredited independent inspection body, and the cooperative's documentation, while detailed, did not meet this requirement. The cooperative had not submitted a third application. I had not followed up to determine whether they intended to. I am setting this down in full because the record should be complete, and because what I am about to describe cannot be properly understood without it. The 42nd hour of the fracture event, 2 hours after I had sent the expanded ping to the secondary contact list as a procedural formality, the Terran Interstellar Relief Cooperative replied. Not with an acknowledgement. Not with a notification that they were reviewing our request. Not with a formal regrets letter. With a transit confirmation. 7 vessels were already in motion. They had diverted upon receiving our Priority 1 ping at hour 40. Not the expanded secondary ping, but the original Priority 1 that had gone to the primary network at hour 8, 32 hours earlier, and which they had been monitoring as non-certified observers of the Sector Coordination Network's emergency feed. They had been watching our situation for 32 hours before I sent them a ping. They had been watching it get worse, and when I sent the secondary contact expansion, the procedural formality, the activation of the fire suppression system, one activates because the protocol requires it. They had already been in motion for 2 hours. The transit confirmation listed the vessels: a hospital ship, 2 heavy configuration cargo freighters, a medical frigate, 2 secondary cargo vessels, and a mobile oxygen production unit, 7 vessels. Estimated arrival, 9 hours from the time of the message. Hour 51 of the event. I read the communication 3 times, then I printed it. Is something I do not ordinarily do with digital communications, and I read it again on paper. I do not know why I did this. I think I wanted to hold it. I calmed Fesivar and told him to prepare docking spires 1 and 2 for incoming human vessels. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how many. 7, I told him. Longer then. The cooperative? I said yes, he said. Counselor. We denied their application twice. I said I was aware of that, he said. Do they know that? I told him I assumed they did. The application correspondence. was a matter of public record in the Sector Coordination Network's filing system. Any registered observer of the network's emergency feed would have access to it. Festivar didn't say anything after that. Neither did I. I closed the comms and sat at my terminal for a moment, looking at the transit confirmation on paper, and then I went to the Great Chamber observation balcony, which overlooks the docking spires and has the widest viewport in the station's administrative sections. They arrived at hour 53, 2 hours earlier than their estimate. By that point, we had lost partial atmosphere in Section 5, the outermost of the at-risk sections, nearest to 12 Alpha's breach, and we're seeing the first confirmed fracture indicators in Junction 11 Beta, pre-fracture stress signatures now but actual initiated microfractures, which meant the cascade clock had moved from projected to real. The 312 residents of Section 5 had been moved to the central transit corridors at hour 48, and were on emergency, ration masks, breathing processed air, in a space that was not designed for 312 people standing in it, children among them, the elderly leaning against the corridor walls on portable rest platforms that Aura's logistic team had set out, because there were not enough seats. The whole station knew the cascade model was advancing. The whole station knew the secondary contacts had been pinged. I am told I did not observe this directly, I was at the terminal, that when the transit confirmation from the cooperative propagated through the station's information system, there was a period of something like silence on the residential levels, and then a period of something that sounded different from silence. From the Great Chamber balcony, I watched the lead vessel come into approach, alignment. I want to describe what I saw accurately because I have found that my memory of it has a quality of sharpness that my memories of normal operations do not, and I want to record it before that quality fades. The lead vessel, the hospital ship, was larger than I had expected, substantially larger. The cooperative's application had listed it as a modified heavy transport refitted for medical operations, and I had formed a mental image from that description. What I was watching come into approach alignment against the backdrop of Vathorsol's upper atmosphere was not what I had imagined. It was long, and the length of it kept becoming apparent in increments as it turned to align, the way a large thing reveals itself only as it moves. Its upper hull was marked with humanitarian designation codes in a size that could be read, significant distance. Not as decoration, I understood, but as identification. The way vessels that intend to be recognized as non-combatant must be readable to any observer in any circumstances. Port side had 8 docking bays open, interior lighting on. Already it had opened those bays during transit. It had been preparing to receive patients since before it arrived. Behind it came the 2 heavy freighters, their cargo configuration visible in the loading bay architecture of their midsections. Behind those, the medical frigate, smaller, faster-looking. They sealser array that I recognized from the Cooperativ's application documentation as a trauma triage configuration, meaning it was built to assess mass casualty situations from orbit and begin triaging resource allocation before any personnel were deployed. Behind those 2 secondary cargo vessels, and then a ship that did not match any classification in my immediate working knowledge, and which I later learned was the Mobile Oxygen Production Unit. A vessel built specifically to manufacture and transfer compressed atmospheric oxygen directly into failing station environments. They brought an oxygen production vessel, not because we had specified one in the distress ping. Our ping had requested oxygen reserve support, meaning stored compressed oxygen in standard transfer cylinders. What they brought was a ship that makes oxygen, a continuous production platform that, once coupled to our systems, would not deplete as stored cylinders deplete, but would keep generating as long as it was connected. I have thought about the decision to bring that vessel specifically, rather than simply loading stored oxygen reserves onto the cargo freighters. It was not a small decision. A mobile oxygen production unit is not a common asset, and its deployment is not costless. Someone in the cooperative's emergency response structure, at some point during the hours between our ping and their departure, made the assessment that a continuous production asset was more appropriate than stored reserves for a structural cascade situation with an uncertain duration. They made that assessment for a station that had twice formally denied their certification applications. I authorized docking. I did not know what else to do. The first human through docking Spire 1 was Dr. Aerith Calloway. I have her name from the crew manifest, which they transmitted along with their docking request. Not after docking, not as a post-arrival formality, as part of the docking request itself, so that our medical coordinators could begin matching cooperative personnel to station needs before the airlock cycled. She was the cooperative's chief surgical coordinator, perhaps 40 years by their reckoning, short, dark hair, and the kind of economy of movement that comes from many years of working in spaces where excess motion costs time. She was carrying a field assessment unit and wearing the cooperative's standard relief uniform, a plain gray-green, no insignia beyond a small cooperative identifier on the left shoulder, and she walked off the gangway at a pace that made it clear she had been thinking the entire 9 hours of transit about what she was going to do when she arrived. She stopped in front of me. I am, like all Vathari, considerably taller than any human, and she tilted her face up slightly to meet my eyes. Without any particular hesitation, she said, "Counselor Saravivan, I'm Dr. Calloway. Tell me where your most acute atmospheric loss is and I'll start there." I told her Section 5. "The 312 in the transit corridors," she said, "right," and turned to the junior coordinator beside her. I would learn his name later. Technician Morales, 26 years old, who had been her operational coordinator for 3 years, and spoke to him in the quick shorthand of people who have worked together long enough that they share a language below the level of full sentences. I heard transit corridor, primary breach, 2 lines before anything else, prep the bay for the mobility cases. Then she turned back to me and said, "Shh. My structural team will need your engineering coordinator, the one tracking the fracture cascade, to meet them in your operations center. They're going to need his models and real-time sensor access." I sent for Fesivar. What happened over the following 22 hours is what I have been trying to write accurately for 3 days, and I find that the difficulty is not in remembering it. I remember it with the unusual sharpness I described earlier, but in rendering it in the scale it actually occurred. It was not one thing. It was a very large number of things happening simultaneously, most of which I observed only partially, and many of which I learned about afterward in Fesivar's engineering logs and the cooperative's own action report, which they filed with the Sector Coordination Network as a matter of their standard practice, and which I have read 4 times. The Mobile Oxygen Production Unit positioned itself adjacent to Section 5's outer hull within 90 minutes of docking. This was faster than I had been told to expect. Fesivar had estimated 3 to 4 hours for coupling and system integration. The cooperative's engineering team had pre-prepared the coupling configuration during transit. Having modeled the Section 5 hull architecture from the structural data we had attached to our distress ping, they arrived with the coupling already designed. Within 6 hours, pressurized oxygen was flowing through the transfer line directly into Section 5's air exchange system, at a rate that not only arrested the atmospheric deficit, but began restoring the section to nominal pressure. Section 5's 312 residents went back inside at hour 6.5. I received this information from the logistics coordinator, who sent it to me as a line item in a status update, and I noted it and then noted it again, the way one notes a number that one needs to be sure one has read correctly. 312 people who had been standing in a transit corridor with masks on their faces were back in their homes because a vest had arrived that made oxygen. At the same time, simultaneously, in the way that things happen simultaneously when the people executing them are organized, Fesivar and the cooperative structural engineering liaison, a tall human named Devora Rice, who had the habit of thinking aloud while looking at data, and did not seem to mind that Fesivar found this unusual, were working through the Cascade model together in the operations center. Reese had brought her own fracture analysis software. She ran in parallel with Fesivar's modeling system, and the two of them spent the first 2 hours cross-referencing their outputs and finding, according to Fesivar's subsequent report, that their models agreed on the critical points and diverged only on timing estimates in ways that were, within acceptable uncertainty bounds. The solution Reese proposed was not one Festivar had arrived at independently, not because he lacked the engineering knowledge, but because the specific hardware required, modular compression brace kits sized for primary ring, junction housings, was not in the station's inventory, and had not occurred to Festivar as an option. It was a technique, Rice told him, developed for precisely this failure mode. A full-width frame junction shear in an orbital ring. The adjacent junction nodes were absorbing redistributed torsion load, and the window before cascade propagation was measured in hours rather than days. The kits were in the cooperative's cargo manifests, not because we had requested them, because the cooperative standardized them for ring fracture responses. The cargo had been loaded before they knew the specific failure mode, because they load for the category of emergency rather than for the specific parameters. Because over 30 years of real-life work they have learned what categories of emergency tend to need. This is the kind of thing that is difficult to convey in an administrative incident account, that they brought something we needed before we knew we needed it. The compression brace installation across 12 Alpha began at hour 7 of their arrival. 4 cooperative structural engineers working alongside 6 of Festivar's team in the Section 12 service corridors in the coolant and metal fatigue air, installing braces across a junction housing that was holding approximately a third of the ring's torsion load by the time they got to it. The work took 11 hours. Festivar supervised and noted in his engineering log that the cooperative's team moved with an efficiency that reflects considerable prior experience in this specific environment. From Festivar is a sentence of considerable admiration. The hospital ship began receiving patients at hour 4 of the cooperative's arrival. Critical cases in the first wave. The station's own medical facility was handling those, supplemented by the cooperative's trauma team, but precautionary evaluations. The elderly who had been on ration masks in the atmospheric deficit sections for hours. Young children whose families were uncertain whether the extended ration period had affected them. Station staff who had been running emergency rotation for 36 hours without adequate rest periods. The hospital ship's 8 bays cycled continuously, and by hour 8 a secondary evaluation station had been set up in docking spire 2 to handle the volume. I visited the secondary evaluation station at hour 10. I do not ordinarily visit medical facilities during emergency operations. My function is administrative coordinations, and I leave medical decisions to the medical coordinators. But I found myself walking toward docking spire 2 at hour 10, and I have tried to account for why, and I think the honest answer is that I needed to see it. I needed to see the people. The secondary station occupied most of the spire's reception bay. The cooperative had set up portable examination panels, and lighting rigs, and a medication dispensary, and there were 8 human medical technicians moving between patients. Vathuri, all of them, sitting on the portable rest platforms or standing in the examination lines, with the calm efficiency that I had already come to recognize as characteristic of the cooperative's personnel. Not hurried, not loud, simply very clear about what they were doing and very consistent in doing it. At the entrance to the spire, helping elderly Vathuri navigate the boarding ramp, which has a slope of perhaps 12 degrees, standard for Vathuri adults, steep for the elderly, particularly for those who had been on rest platforms for hours and whose legs were uncertain. There was a young human medical technician whose name I later learned was Technician Aria Vasquez. She was perhaps 24. She had positioned herself at the base of the ramp without being assigned there, as far as I could determine from the cooperative's personnel logs. It was not in her designated role for the operation, which was general triage support. She had seen the first group of elderly Vathuri arrive at the ramp, and she had moved to the base and begun, offering her arm as a steadying brace. I watched her help 7 elderly Vathuri up that ramp while I was standing there. Each time, she positioned herself slightly differently. Higher on the ramp for those who seemed most unsteady, lower for those who wanted the brace only for the steepest section. She did not explain what she was doing or ask permission. She simply watched each person coming to the ramp and positioned herself where she would be most useful. I do not know why this is the detail I have spent the most time with. The compression brace installation saved the station. The oxygen production unit saved Section 5. The hospital ship saw hundreds of patients and discharged them all, and had their records transmitted to our own medical system before departure. These are all larger in scale than one person at the base of a ramp, but there is something about the specific nature of that act. The decision, made without instruction, to be where an elderly person needed a steadying arm, and to remain there for as long as elderly people were arriving, that I have found myself turning to. It is the smallest possible version of the thing that the cooperative was doing across the entirety of the station, seeing what was needed and moving to provide it, without waiting to be asked, without a directive, without a claim. The compression brace installation at 12 Alpha was certified complete at hour 19 of the cooperative's arrival. Junction 11 beta's microfracture indicators had stabilized within 2 hours of the brace installation. Festivar attributes this to the load redistribution effect of the 12 alpha bracing, which reduced the torsion stress reaching 11 beta to below the propagation threshold. Junction 10 delta and 13 gamma, which had been in the cascade projection as probable secondary failure points, did not develop fracture signatures. The cascade, which had been advancing on a clock that our own engineering capability could not stop, had been arrested. Sections 4 through 7 remained intact. The great chamber remained intact. 11,400 people were here, in a structure that was stable enough to operate while we sourced the permanent repair components for 12 Alpha. Festivar estimated would take 30 to 40 days, and which the cooperative's liaison, in a detail I will describe shortly, had also provided assistance with. I want to record what it felt like to receive Festivar's certification of the brace installation, because it is not something I will have difficulty describing, and I want it in the record. I was at my terminal when his message came in. I read it once. I read it again. Then I leaned back in my chair, which is not something I do during working hours, and I looked at the ceiling of my office, which is a vaulted ceiling with the architectural detailing typical of high perch design. The layered arch motif, the copper inlay work that catches the light from the viewports. And I stayed in that position for some period of time that I did not log. I do not cry in official contexts. 11 cycles in this office and I have not done so. I did not do so at that moment. But I stayed with the ceiling for a while, and I was aware that the quality of the air in the room, nominal, standard, strictly unremarkable, was not something I had been taking for granted an hour ago. 11,400 people, all of them here. At hour 21, Dr. Calloway came to my office. The operative work was essentially complete by then. The brace installation certified. The oxygen transfer lines maintaining nominal pressure in the repressurized sections. The hospital ship cycling through its final patient evaluations. She came, I believe, simply to ask if there was anything else. She sat across from me with the field assessment unit on her knee and asked how the council was managing. Not the structural situation. I think she understood that I had adequate information on the structural situation. She asked about the council, the people. I told her they were managing. I told her the ration period had been difficult for the elderly sections, particularly those who had been in the Sci-Fi transit corridors. She nodded. She said, the cooperative ship would be providing relay consultation for the next 30 days for any longer-term recovery cases our medical staff wanted a second opinion on. She said this the way one mentions a logistical detail, not a favor. Then there was a brief silence, and I said what I had been thinking about how to say since the transit confirmation had arrived at hour 42. I said, Dr. Calloway, I am aware, I want you to know that I am aware of the history between this station and your organization. She looked at me. Eyes are dark and have the quality I mentioned earlier of not going anywhere while they look at you. She said, the certification applications? Yes. She said, we got your message at hour 40 and we started loading. I said, I understand. I am trying to express that I understand what that means in context. She considered me for a moment. There was something in her expression that was not impatience and not judgment. Something more like the look of a person who has thought about this, who has a settled position on it, who is not arriving at it fresh in my office. She said, First counselor, I've been doing relief work for 17 years. There are 100 reasons a certification review doesn't go a particular way. I don't make assumptions about any of them. She stood and picked up the field assessment unit. She offered me her hand in the Terran manner, which I had been briefed on but had not performed. I took it. Her hand was small and entirely certain. She said, "I hope the repair sourcing goes quickly. 12 Alpha housings are a specific fabrication. If your procurement office runs into sourcing delays, we have a manufacturing contact in the Verith industrial sector that has filled similar orders. I'll have the liaison send the details." I said thank you. She said, "You're welcome, first counselor," and walked out. The cooperative's vessels began departure sequencing at hour 22. The hospital ship first, then the 2 heavy freighters, then the oxygen production unit, the secondary cargo vessels, and finally the medical frigate, which made one last full-ring sensor pass before aligning for transit. I watched it from the great chamber observation balcony. Frigate's sensor array was active during the pass. I assume it was logging a final structural baseline for our records, perhaps for their own after-action documentation. Then it banked away from the ring, found its transit bearing, and followed the rest of them out. The balcony was empty except for me. It was the first time in 22 hours I had been somewhere without the sound of human voices in the background, and the quiet had a quality I had not anticipated. Not unpleasant. More like the quality of a room after something large has been carefully removed from it, and the room is back to its proper proportions, and the proportions are different than they were before, because you now know what was in them. Through the balcony's glass, Vather Sol was precisely as it always is. Green and copper landmasses, the upper cloud layer soft and bright, the ring's shadow cutting across the cloud layer at the standard orbital angle. Junction 12 Alpha's breach scar was visible as a slight darkening in the hull plating, the compression brace array protruding along the junction line in clean utilitarian rows, holding a load they were built to hold. The air on the balcony was nominal. Pressure nominal. Composition nominal. 11,400 people. All of them here. All of them breathing air that tasted like normal air. I have been at this terminal for 3 days. The formal requirements of this account are complete above. The Directorate has the structural data, the medical data, the contact log, the cascade timeline, the brace installation certification, the atmospheric restoration record. Everything that needs to be in the record is there. What I have been writing for 3 days is what comes next, and I have written it and deleted it and written it again. And I'm going to write it now and leave it in, because the record should be accurate, and accuracy includes this. In Cycle 7 of the current era, I denied the Terran Interstellar Relief Cooperative's first application for certified status in the Vathar Reach. My stated grounds: procedural alignment, credential cross-validation requirements, and a policy concern about the precedent of admitting a species-specific operator into a multi-system routing matrix without established standards. That category were accurately stated. They were also, I have concluded, grounds that I applied to the cooperative specifically with rigor. I did not consistently apply to other applicants in the certification queue during the same period. I have reviewed the Cycle 7 certification log. There are 4 other applications approved in that cycle under standards that were, by any fair reading, less stringent than what I applied to the cooperative. I did not note this inconsistency at the time. I accepted my own reasoning as sufficient and moved to the next item on the docket. In Cycle 8, I denied the revised application on the grounds that the vessel certification updates were self-reported rather than independently verified. I have now read the revised application's full documentation, including the third-party appendix that I apparently opened for 40 seconds in my reading record before issuing the denial. The appendix contained third-party audit records from an accredited inspection body in the adjacent sector, directly addressing the verification concern I had cited. It was in the application. I did not read it. I am reporting this in the official account because the official account is the record, and the record should be complete. I have also initiated a full review of the cooperative certification status. I have assigned it to myself, which is not standard practice. Normally, such reviews are assigned to a junior coordinator for initial assessment. I have assigned it to myself because I owe them that. The review will not take long. There is nothing in the application, either cycle 7 or cycle 8. That should have produced either denial. I want to say one more thing, and then I will close this account. I have administered relief to perhaps 40 distress events in the Vathor Reach in 11 cycles. I have allocated hospital ships and oxygen reserves and structural engineering teams to species in exactly the position I was in during this event. I have read the impact assessments afterward, the lives preserved, the structural losses averted, the eventual returns to normal operation, and I have read them with satisfaction, because they confirmed that the system worked and that my administration of it was sound. I have never been inside the system before. I have only ever been outside it, managing it, making the allocations. I have never been the species counting masks. I have never been the one watching the fracture signatures advance on the monitoring display and doing arithmetic about docking spire capacity. I have never been the one wondering, at hour 40 of a priority 1 event, whether the secondary contact list was a real list or a procedural gesture toward hope. I know something now that I did not know in cycle 7 when I wrote the first denial letter. I know what it is to be on the other side of the routing matrix. I know what it is to watch the response log populate with formal regrets and to understand entry by entry that the system you administer is not going to be the system that saves you. I know what it is to send a ping to a 13th entry on a secondary contact list and not expect an answer. And I know what it is when the answer comes. It came without invoice, without claim, without any reference to at any point during the 22 hours they were on this station to either of the letters I had written them. Dr. Calloway, when I raised it directly, said she did not make assumptions about certification reviews, and that they had been in the sector when our message arrived. That was all she said about it. Someone at the cooperative at some point before or during their transit made a decision about the appropriate response to a distress call from a station that had formally told them twice that there was no place for them in our network. The decision they made was, bring the oxygen production unit, bring the compression brace kits for the failure mode. We'll find when we get there. Bring the surgical teams and the full hospital ship with the bays already open. Arrive 2 hours early. Station someone at the ramp for the elderly, and then leave without asking for anything back. I had a last exchange with Dr. Calloway that I did not include in the main narrative of this account, and I will include it now at the end, because it belongs here. She paused at my office door as she was leaving, after the handshake and source contact and the thank you. She paused and looked back, not at me directly but at the window behind my desk, faces toward the junction array and the hull exterior and Vathor Sol's cloud layer below. She said, I've been in about 60 of these. The ones where people get out okay, and the ones where they don't, I said. And what is the difference? She looked at the window for a moment. She said, usually it's not the fracture. Usually it's whether someone came. She looked back at me then. She said, someone always should. Then she left. I am First Counselor Saravan of the Vathori High Perch. I have administered this station and this bureau for 11 cycles. I have written 418 formal incident accounts, including this one. This is the only one I have ever needed to apologize inside of. The certification review is open. The compression braces are holding. The air is nominal. Someone always should. That is all.